Okay, sure. Then I will also play the recording. Is that correct?
You're right. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
As soon as you're done. All right. Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much for being here on a Monday evening. So which is kind of a special occasion for one of these events. Morrow Lecture is a long time tradition in the departments of physics and biology, and they are hosted by us one after the other, kind of in an alternate fashion. To just kind of introduce where this all started, the Roger and Jean Morrow Distinguished Lecture is funded through an endowment in honor of George M. Morrow, who was the first head of the WIU Department of Physics, and his wife, Jean, who was one of the university's first female faculty members in the WIU Department of Biological Sciences. So that's the connection with biology and physics, and we have been hosting those alternate years. Last year, the plans were fouled by the pandemic, and we couldn't turn things around to quickly host this virtually. If we could, one other thing that's important to point out that the biology chair, Dr. Renessa Cooper, graciously agreed to allow us to host this year's Morrow Lecture out of our turn. It would have been her turn to find a speaker. And I am personally excited to hear from today's speaker, our 2021 Morrow Lecturer, Dr. Rebecca Krystyniak. And I'm going to hand over the screen to Dr. Rabchak, who is the College of Arts and Sciences Assistant Dean at the Quad Cities campus, to take over and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Kopali. Yeah, so it's my great honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Rebecca Krystyniak. I made Dr. Krystyniak's acquaintance, Rebecca or Becky. We probably let's bring it down a notch in terms of formality. So we'll come to Becky. I met Becky 2 years ago at a summer workshop as Dr. Brooks and Dr. Babu and I attended that conference to learn more about the Learning Assistant Program. We had already introduced it in the Quad Cities campus. We wanted to extend it to the Macomb campus. We wanted to learn more about it, so we attended a regional workshop that was held jointly between St. Cloud State University in Minnesota and Anoka Ramsey Community College, where Becky is currently the STEM dean, academic dean. And it was a wonderful conference and so clearly and articulately presented, so well organized. And so my immediate thought upon returning was, we have to get Becky to come here and share some of her insights, particularly because she has gone through developing the Learning Assistant Program as a faculty member, as department chair, and now as a STEM dean. And so from those three different perspectives, I think are very useful for us in thinking about how this program might be, from our humble beginnings at the moment, might be scaled up and sustained in the future, and really help create a kind of a unique and distinctive atmosphere and academic environment for our students. So let me say a little bit about Dr. Krystyniak. So if my recommendation is not good enough, so let's just look at the objective facts regarding her background. So she is, as I mentioned, currently the STEM academic dean at Anoka Ramsey Community College in nearby Coon Rapids, Minnesota, near St. Cloud. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Carthage College, Master of Science in Analytical Chemistry, and a PhD in chemistry education from University of Northern Colorado. She completed postdoctoral work at the University of California in Berkeley. After graduating from Berkeley, she began serving as a faculty member at St. Cloud State University in 2003, and including 2 years as chair of the chemistry department. She championed the Teacher Preparation Initiative, the Ignite Center at SCSU, and served as director. Please welcome our honored speaker, Dr. Becky Krystyniak, and I will, let me tell you about how this is going to go tonight. Yeah, please give virtual, yeah, there we go. So let me let you know how things go tonight, and then I'm gonna have to mute myself so that you don't hear my dog in the background. Becky has already prepared a lecture. And an analogy I thought of for this lecture is this is going to be a little bit like Dora the Explorer. So there's going to be a recorded presentation, and then there'll be a few instances where she will just pause and wait for you to respond. And what she's going to do is during those pauses, she's going to monitor the chat and she'll prompt you for some input. She'll monitor the chat and interact with you in this way. So hopefully, even though it's a Zoom lecture and a Zoom presentation, but there'll be enough interaction that you can really get all your questions answered as we go through the presentation. So without any further ado, I will switch over to sharing my screen with the presentation, and we'll go from there. So. Oops, I got to stop something. I got to make sure I share with the computer sound. There we go.
Hello, my name is Becky Krystyniak, and I am the STEM Dean at Anoka Ramsey Community College, which is in the northern suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today, I'm going to talk with you about active learning and learning assistance, which I'll mostly call LAs moving forward in STEM. And we're going to look at how this model allows us to facilitate student learning in order to close the opportunity gap. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to consider two questions. What is equity, and what does it look like in your classroom? So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to have us quietly think through those two questions, kind of frame in your mind, what do you think equity is and what does it look like in your classroom? If you're watching this asynchronously, what I'd like you to do is just write it down, take a few notes, type it up, or do just kind of get a good model in your head of what that looks like. If you're joining us on Monday night as part of the watch party, I'd love for you to go ahead and type your responses to these two questions in the chat, just so we kind of get an idea of where your starting point is regarding equity and what it looks like in your classroom. So for the next 2 to 3 minutes, I'm just going to be silent to give you that time to think through and also to consider having that opportunity to go ahead and type something into the chat. So go ahead and get started. Again, please feel free to type your responses in the chat box if you're watching live, or to just take down a few notes if you're watching asynchronously. I'm going to give you about 1 more minute. All right, so as we move into the next slide, please feel free to continue typing your answers into the chat box and really thinking about the terms that we're going to talk about and how they align with or maybe conflict with what some of your initial ideas were around equity and what it looks like in your classroom. One of the places that I really love for getting resources around equity and inclusion is the Center for Urban Education, which is at, I believe, San Diego State University, or maybe it's University of San Diego. And what they do is they have a ton of resources both for faculty and for administrators to really think about how we can move our classrooms toward a more equity-focused pedagogy. So what they did is they put together a few slides just to, again, get us thinking about terms that we often use in place of equity. The first one is equality. And the idea is that we have this belief that everything is equal, right? We care about all students equally. We give them all the same opportunities. You know, due dates are all exactly the same, regardless of what students' circumstances are, etc. And I think for a lot of people, they often kind of superimpose equality and equity when they're thinking about the ways in which they need to set up their classroom, even just the ways in which they think about the world. So the problem is that the world isn't equal, right? So when we think about students and we think about what they're bringing to the classroom, the types of experiences they've had, the types of resources they have are certainly not equal. And so this slide kind of gives you some ideas around what are some of the benefits that some students have had, right? They've had educated parents, they've had folks who've helped them navigate ACTs and SATs. They've had opportunities to take honors classes, AP classes, concurrent enrollment classes, classes at the college, getting their associates while they're still in high school. And there's even this idea of just that idea of social capital, right? Knowing what college is going to be like, knowing people who went to college, the expectation that they should be going to college. And so when we think about students, we can think about students as those who were resourced, who had those resources, and other students as being under-resourced, right? It's not that they've been underprepared. It's that they haven't been given the same opportunities. They didn't have the same resources as other students did. And there are lots of different ways in which that can play out. But I think it's really important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about your classroom and you're thinking about how you're setting it up in such a way to make sure that all students have the opportunity to be successful and to learn the content and be able to progress through your programs. So another thing that we often think about is this idea of diversity, right? Where we usually focus on this idea of bringing more diverse students into the pathway. And I really love this visual of the broken ladder, right? Because what we're saying is, yes, we're bringing more people in, but we're not changing that pathway, right? We're not taking into consideration what are those resources? What are the experiences and other types of education and opportunities that other students have had that give them that leg up in the classroom, that make them maybe more ready or be kind of higher up that ladder versus students that we're just bringing in who are under-resourced. And so we're bringing them into a situation where they're not being able to succeed because that pathway is not equal. So when we start thinking about equity, right, the idea is that we give students what they need, right? Not all students need the same thing. The students who come into that broken pathway who are under-resourced, they need different supports. They need different opportunities, maybe different explanations, other types of supports to be able to be successful than maybe those students who were very resourced coming into college. And so how do we identify what those students need? And I think really it's looking at your data, identifying whether or not you have those opportunity gaps, right? Where you're seeing that some students are doing significantly better in your classes than others, and where those break down. Really thinking strategically about how you set up your classrooms and how you train faculty and staff and administrators to really think about teaching through an equity lens. And also really understanding what are the practices that you're utilizing in your classroom that could impede equity. So again, this is really just getting us to start thinking about equity, thinking about what are those maybe racial inequities that are happening in your classroom? Are you noticing that some students are doing better than others? So maybe your white students are being more successful in your classroom than your Black and brown students. What does that look like? What's happening in your classroom that might be causing that, that disparity in student achievement? A recognition that the practices that we're using may not be working. Maybe they're working for one group of students, but they're not working across all groups. I think the most important thing around equity, and I think this is where many people struggle, is a recognition that inequity is really a function or a dysfunction of structures, policy, and practices. It's the pieces that we've put into place or that have been in place for years that are inadvertently causing inequity. And so really thinking about those and thinking about how we might be able to dismantle some of that so that all students can be successful in our classrooms. Questioning assumptions, recognizing stereotypes and even our own implicit biases in the classroom, and also taking action to eliminate inequity. And that's a big piece of what I want to talk to you about today is some ways that you can make changes in your classroom, specifically surrounding your pedagogy in order to be able to eliminate inequity. And so this last slide, I'm not going to read to you. I just want you to be able to see this. This is from a document called Step Up and Lead for Equity. That's from the AAC&U. Where it really gets you to think about what does it mean to be equity minded. And so it kind of sums up some of the pieces that we have talked about already in terms of equity, thinking about what it means both in terms of kind of historically the ways in which we have prevented groups of students from being successful, and really starting to think about your courses, your programs, your policies through an equity lens. Again, I don't want to spend, I really wanted us to have that opportunity to just start to think about equity, to set the, kind of set the stage for the rest of this presentation and the rest of the conversation. And so what I'm hoping is if you found something new that you might be able to add to your definition of equity, if you notice that your definition or your thoughts around equity were more focused on equality, that maybe you have a little bit more understanding of this distinction between those two. And as you start thinking about what equity might look like in your classroom, that's kind of going to be the rest of our presentation, is really just thinking about, again, what are some things we can do from a pedagogy perspective that allow you to create a more equitable classroom. And really, with that in mind, that idea of an equitable classroom, that outcome is really closing that opportunity gap between students. So how do we provide opportunities to increase equity and inclusion in the STEM classroom? I shared with you that I am a STEM dean at Anoka Ramsey Community College. Prior to that, I was a chemistry faculty member, full professor and chair of the chemistry department. I also worked with students who were studying to be teachers. And I would both students who were going to be high school chemistry teachers, but I also taught science to students who were going to be elementary teachers. So I've also worked with a lot of STEM faculty. And one of the things that STEM faculty really struggle with, in my experience, is really thinking about equity and inclusion, and how it relates to STEM and what that looks like. And so what I wanted to do is bring forth a couple of outcomes from research, just to get us starting to think about what we might want to do differently in the classroom. The first one is to focus on course policies, practices, grades, and assignments. That is something that I'm not going to deep dive with you into today. If you are planning to attend the workshop on Tuesday, this is certainly something we can talk about as part of that workshop. Again, the Center for Urban Education is a great place to look at for some of these ideas around what that would look like. But for us, we're really going to focus more on pedagogy, which kind of leads into the second bullet, which is this idea that the research in STEM ed has really shown that inquiry-based instructional strategies lead to larger gains than traditional methods for teaching STEM. And when I say traditional methods for teaching STEM, I'm dancing around the term lecture, right? So the idea of a pure lecture without interaction, where a faculty member is pretty much just talking and providing content from their perspective. And so what that research has shown, probably over the last 20 to 25 years, is that when we engage students in their own learning, we find that women and underrepresented students are more successful in the classroom. And when I say underrepresented, I mean both students of color, or BIPOC students, and also first generation college students, and again, as well as women. So we can also think about that in terms of the term inclusive teaching. And what that does is that really starts identifying this idea of culturally responsive pedagogy, which I'll talk about again a little bit today, but more in the workshop on Tuesday. And so when we think about inclusive teaching, again, this really helps to support this idea of enrollment, retention, and success of underrepresented students. And I specifically quoted from this article because I really love this quote. And, it's this idea that, we can design all the summer bridge and first year programs we want, but if we neglect pedagogy, then we're building a really nice house only to furnish it with stuff we found on the curb. And so for me, I think that's such a great metaphor for thinking about the fact that we often want to pin blame on student success in our classrooms, or in our courses, based on things that are happening outside of our classrooms. And we invest money and more money into those kind of outside projects, right? Into advising, into summer bridge, into programs that build up study skills, and provide other types of ways to allow students to build skills, which again kind of moves us a little bit more towards a deficit mindset around our students, as opposed to really focusing on what's happening in the classroom and our pedagogy, and really investing in professional development for faculty in those types of strategies that we know from the research help students be successful, that we know close that opportunity gap. Another article that I found that I was really excited about, and so I included it, was this idea around the development of metacognitive skills. And if you haven't heard that term, metacognition, again, we'll deep dive into that a little bit in the presentation or the workshop on Tuesday. But really, it's that idea of really thinking about and focusing on how you learn best, right? And so again, that's giving you that opportunity to reflect, to investigate, to identify what are the things you know and what do you not know, and where are the gaps, and how can you fill those in. And what this article found was that purposefully focusing on helping students develop those metacognitive skills in their STEM courses helped those students who have been academically underserved. So again, if you go back to that earlier slide that I showed you, right, it helped those students pursue their rigorous STEM degrees. And what that research found is that they were more successful in their courses. So in other words, they were getting better grades. They were being retained at the institution. They were being retained in their major. And they were following students who were then going on into their careers and into their graduate schools and their post-college types of activities. And so that's really exciting to think about the fact that if we can do more of that, give students more opportunity to really think about how they learn and to give them practice doing that as part of their courses, that not only helps them understand the content better, but it helps turn them into stronger STEM students. Now, this next article or this next piece of research is also one of my favorites. And what we found, or what the authors found, was that students believe that they learn best from listening to a lecture. So even from those lecturers who feel that they're really wonderful and they are, providing lots of opportunities and they're, particularly gifted in telling the jokes and explaining things, right? Students believe and they give feedback to those instructors through really high evaluations, through, providing faculty with like Faculty of the Year and teaching awards. They believe that that's how they learn best. But when you look at the research of those same students in an active learning classroom, those students are learning more. They are being more successful. And so part of what this research did was try to figure out, why is it that students think that they learn better from listening to a lecture? And a big chunk of that is they just think it's easier, right? When they're doing active learning, the cognitive effort is on them. They are actively engaging with the material. They're going through those experiences of having to make sense of information in the classroom, right? In real time. And to them, that's difficult and that makes it hard, right? There's more of that cognitive effort. And so that makes students think that they're learning less because it's hard. They're not recognizing that hard feeling, right, is actually them creating new connections in their brain. And so, having that sort of conversation even with students is important to help them understand how they learn. And then the last piece that I wanted to include here is really this idea of culturally responsive pedagogy. And I have the definition, and again, I don't really want to read through this, but what it is it's really taking into consideration when you're designing your classroom, how the types of examples you're using, the types of activities that you're creating or finding for your classroom, the ways in which students are able to demonstrate their learning, right? And taking into consideration how they learn and what are their ways of knowing, and thinking about that from a cultural perspective. One of the things the reason that I'm bringing this up is one of the big components of culturally responsive pedagogy is this idea of actually active learning. It's engaging students, giving them the opportunity to talk about the content, because many of our students come from oral traditions. That's how they learn. They tell stories and they pass on those stories from generation to generation. And so when they're in classrooms where they don't have that opportunity, and they're just listening and not getting that chance to be able to engage and talk, that does affect their ability to learn. It affects their ability to be able to create connections and create that understanding. So the next piece then, now that we've kind of set this stage around equity, is we're going to focus on active learning. because from this research, right, this idea around getting students engaged in their learning, we know that students learn more. We know that it's a component of culturally responsive pedagogy. So how are we utilizing that in the classroom? And then also then, how do LAs or learning assistants help us to implement active learning in the classroom? So again, I'm going to give you a minute or so. And what I'd like you to do is identify what is active learning. So I want you to get that in your head, think about how you define it. And again, for those of you who are watching this on Monday evening as part of the watch party, please feel free to add something in the chat about what you think active learning is. And so I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to give you about a minute to gather your thoughts, type something in, write something down, and then we'll move forward. Okay, I'm going to give you another 30 seconds. Okay, so I always find it funny when we have kind of this silent wait time because it always seems to take forever. But it's such an important part of providing our students, and you in this case, the opportunity to kind of gather those initial thoughts, kind of get your brain ready to be able to have the conversation and think about how you might be making some new connections. So I will tell you that when I think about active learning, the way that I define it is any way that students are actively engaged in their own learning. And in other words, they are hands-on and minds-on. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but they're actually doing the work of the learning, right? So from that perspective, the faculty member has created or found activities or assignments for those students to do, for their students to do, that engage them in creating those connections, in actively discovering the work that they're doing. Oftentimes we call that, it's based in what's called constructivism. And again, constructivism and this idea of social constructivism. And so again, we'll talk about that on Tuesday. But just thinking about that in terms of we're engaging students in their own learning. So there are a lot of terms that people use when they talk about active learning. So I think of active learning as kind of that large umbrella, and then based on your field, based on your age, in some cases, some of these terms came out 30 years ago. Sometimes they're brand new terms. It might just be the type that you're comfortable with, or the articles, or again, kind of your area of expertise or your content area. But pretty much these are all just slightly different approaches to active learning. So discovery, inquiry, project-based, peer-led team learning, which is called PLTL, the idea of a flipped classroom, which is where you would have students all actively engaged in the classroom the entire time you're together, and maybe they're watching videos outside of class. Or reading outside of class, or doing something else to kind of prepare them with any sort of content that they might need, or background information. And then even things like oral assessments are considered active learning. So hopefully we're thinking about what that might look like in the classroom. We know that active learning is important. We know that it helps close the opportunity gap. And so what I'm going to talk about now for the rest of the time is this idea of using learning assistants, or LAs, and what LA supported courses look like. Okay, so LAs are undergraduate students who are helping to facilitate conversations or discussions around those groups of students. So if you think about it, if you set up your classroom, you've got students maybe working in small groups. And if you were the only one in the classroom, you would possibly be walking around and trying to get to every single one of those groups of students. What LAs do is they are other people in the room. They are the peers who are going through, and they're helping the students as well as you. So they're able to go and have interactions with each of those groups of students to help them understand the content, to help those students as they're working through their own understanding. And so when you think about LA supported courses, again, that's this idea that they're working in their groups. Students are articulating and defend their ideas, but the instructors are kind of making those decisions of what types of activities, how they are setting those up in such a way that helps students move forward in their understanding. So I am going to show you a quick little video where an LA will share with you what LAs do.
But we would, essentially they would ask me questions like, oh, how does this happen? And why is this right? They would love to ask me, is this right? Am I going in the right path? So as an LA, we're trained. You're not there to say, yes, you're in the right path, or no, that's wrong, do this, but more like to guide them and get into the right place. So I would ask them, questioning them back, like, oh, why did you do this? Or like, what about, like, are you sure that that's the way it is? Or asking them questions that prompt their ideas rather than giving them my idea of what was happening or whether it's right or it's wrong. Just getting them to think about it more deeply, because a lot of the times they were the ones that had the answers, not me. I have the answers too, but I didn't have to tell them the answer because they were able to find it within themselves. Just asking them the right questions for them to question their own thinking and what they've been doing, it helped them get to the right point. So that's what most of the interactions look like. And then in we had, so the LAs would run a board meeting. So the board meeting, we would have the students work on the assignment or the experiment. They would run the experiment, they would test. And then we'd have a group meeting where all the groups would get together and we would discuss what they had done, the results they got, and then we would get to a consensus most of the time on what was going on. And that's how we would get to the physics of all the experiments that we're doing. And so that was something I did. Me and other LAs at the same time would lead that discussion to get the students to get to the physics behind what they were doing and the laws, and getting them to understand their experiments better and like see the results, what it meant. I mean, I learned a lot of things as a student because once I was put in the other side of the teaching and learning interaction, I got to see that teachers, what they struggle with, because teachers struggle with things that students don't realize as a student, because you're like, oh, I have to learn and they have to teach me. Well, but it's when you're a teacher, you have to be able to know how to teach. And so seeing this other side, there's certain responsibilities that fall on a student, and being able to see like what's expected of me as a student and how to better do these things, because I was on the other side now. I could see what students do that weren't. So all of those things helped me be a better student in my other classes. Cool. And you memorize whatever is there, you're going to do well, because memorizing is not learning. You have to understand why things are and like the reasons behind what you're being told. So be more of like a researcher, I guess. Just look into it. Don't just believe everything they tell you. Just go back and make sure you understand why, because that'll help you remember it afterwards too.
So one of the things about LAs is that they're peers who are in the classroom, who are working with students. And when I'm working with faculty and we talk about the research around expert novice, one of the things that really tends to blow their mind is that when we talk about social constructivism, what you learn is that students actually learn better from peers than they do from their faculty. Because as a faculty member, as an expert, you've clustered your knowledge much more effectively in your brain. And so what happens is you often forget all of the various little steps and pieces of information that need to happen or students need to understand to connect from one concept to another or to be able to solve a problem. Whereas their peers who have still kind of an advanced novice understanding, right? They remember that their understanding isn't as complex as an expert's is. And so what happens is by bringing in LAs into your classroom, it allows us to use the best of both worlds. You've got the faculty member being able to kind of create that learning environment and identify and build kind of that understanding for students. But then you also have those LAs who are in the classroom who are closer in terms of their understanding, who can actually help students make those connections more clearly and more easily. They remember better than we do as faculty what it was like to learn those concepts and where the challenges are and where students kind of get hung up. And so as we move forward and we're thinking about this, that's another way that those LAs are really effective in the classroom. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you some data because again, as STEM folks, we always like to know what the data is telling us. And so I'm going to show you a couple different pieces of data. This first one is from the University of Colorado Boulder, and they're actually the college where the Learning Assistant program began, and it began back in 2001 and 2002. And so one thing you'll notice, hopefully looking at this data, is that as more folks, as the LAs were implemented and faculty started seeing success, that the number of faculty who wanted LAs grew, and the number of LAs that they had at the institution grew, because what they saw was that students were being more successful. They were closing the opportunity gap. And not only that, but students began to kind of demand that they have the ability to be able to have LAs in the classroom. They want to know why they don't have LAs in all of their classes. And so this just kind of gives you this idea that once you get that going and you've got that system and students see and experience LAs and faculty do, that you see that growth within the institution. This next piece of data is from general chemistry using what's called the concept inventory, which is really focusing on students' understanding of concepts as opposed to their ability to solve algorithmic problems. And so when you look at the student, at the data, you'll see percentage in terms of their scores on the concept inventory, and then what happened post. So where were they at the beginning of the semester and where were they at the end of the semester? And so for 2007, this is where they were without LAs. When you look at the following 3 years, you see a significant jump in student success in the class student success on the concept inventory, having those LAs. Students were being more successful. They were learning more about general chemistry, and that was showing up in their scores on the concept inventory. So the next piece of data that I wanted to show you was this idea of retention. So if students were in classes where they had exposure to LAs, were they more likely to stay at the institution for the second year of college? And so if you look at this data, we've got 27,000 students is the N. And it's the students who maybe came to school less prepared. Again, I like to say under-resourced, but again, this is not my personal data, and that's the language they used. But you'll notice those students were more likely to continue into their second year of college. So we're seeing that even just their exposure to LAs is encouraging students to stay. And if you've done any work talking about sense of belonging, thinking about the fact that one of the biggest predictors for whether or not students are successful is whether or not they feel that their instructor cares about them. Being in a class with LAs, that's another person for them to build relationships with. And in my experience working with LAs and my experience supporting faculty professional development around LAs, we found that that is exactly the case. Students are building relationships. LAs see the students as like they become protective of those students. I've had LAs talk about the students they work with as their kids. Like they have this sense of responsibility for helping those students be successful. So it's not not surprising that students who are in classes that have LAs are having a larger sense of belonging, are having or an increased sense of belonging, are more likely to stay at the institution. So I'm going to bring up the next slide. And this one's a little bit more complex. And so I'm going to kind of talk you through it. What this data is looking at is how majority women, underrepresented men, and underrepresented women, what their gains are in class in relation to those of majority males. Okay, so for example, in the very first set of data where it says in a traditional classroom, underrepresented women have gains that are only 53% as large as those of majority men in kind of traditional lecture-based courses. So then if you'll notice, you get to collaborative, and that's some interesting data. But then when you get to LA supported, right, now you'll see everyone did better and we decreased the gap in almost every single comparison. And so that is really, in my opinion, that is really exciting. Again, active learning often will increase some of that. We talked about students finding that sometimes they don't want to have to do the work in an active learning classroom. But having the LAs there, having them there to help engage and help with learning really does increase students' success in their courses. I'm sorry, we already talked about that one. I went the wrong way. Next up, failure rates. We find that they're lower in LA supported classes. Again, we've got some nice big sample sizes, 32,000 overall with 23,000 with LA support. And as you notice, going across in terms of how students are doing with LAs and without LAs, we again see that students are being able to be more successful when they have LAs. Because again, on the left-hand side, that's your course failure rate. So in all cases, students are being more successful when they have LAs in the classroom. The other outcome of LAs is actually the experiences that the LAs have themselves. Originally, the Colorado built this model with the intention of having recruiting students to become secondary STEM teachers. They wanted them to have the experience of basically teaching and working with peers at the undergraduate level so that then they would hopefully decide to become STEM teachers. So that was kind of one of the main reasons that they had gotten some funding to do this work. And what they found was that in actuality, right, students who were in the program and had served in LAs were more likely to use research-based instructional practices or strategies. So again, they're becoming good teachers because they're using teaching methods, pedagogies that we know from the research are effective. In other words, they're more likely to be using active learning inquiry-based learning in their classrooms. They're more likely to have students interacting with each other and working in groups, etc. So LAs are becoming good K-12 teachers. They also found that LAs were more likely to persist to degree than a matched sample of their peers. And this is something that I would hear over and over again from my LAs, is that by going back and working in a classroom, right, and being in LA, that not only gave them the opportunity to go back and review the material, but it gave them an opportunity to do more of a deep dive and have a better understanding of the material. As part of the LA program, I will tell you in a few slides around a pedagogy course that the LAs take, where they really get the opportunity to think about how people learn and also how they learn. And so they end up using those strategies in their own classes moving forward and being more successful. So while this is showing some data around their persistence to degree, there is quite a bit of data that we have that actually shows that students that are LAs are also outperforming their peers that are not LAs in their advanced level classes. So we're seeing that this program is not just positively affecting the students in the classroom, but it's also having great outcomes for the LAs themselves. So what are the LAs doing that leads to these outcomes? The question, or the answer for the most part, is we're not sure. And that has led to a lot of research that's currently occurring around LAs and what's happening and exactly what is leading to these outcomes. So when we think about that, we're going to look at what some of the things that people say, right? LAs bring that human concern into the lives of students and faculty. So I've been talking earlier about faculty building relationships, this idea of sense of belonging, this idea that students are able to build relationships, they're able to feel a connection with their LAs. They don't want to let their LAs down, and the LAs don't want to let the students down. And so there's just a lot of opportunities for students to really see the humanity in each other, to learn that people do learn differently, and that just because they learn one way doesn't mean that's the only way to be successful. And so what that really, again, provides us that opportunity to think about equity and what are the different things that students need to be successful. What are the different experiences, the different explanations, the different opportunities, the different perspectives that students need to really have a better understanding of the content and how it aligns with their own cultural understandings and beliefs. So what does this look like kind of in a model, right? So typically you have an instructor and they are lecturing to students. When you transform your class with LAs, this is more of a model of what it looks like. You have students working in small groups. They're all collaborating with each other. They're having conversations. You have LAs who are facilitating those groups. And then they also go back and interact with the instructor. So as the instructor, you're designing the active learning, or you're designing the learning activities, you're designing the class content, but then you're working both one-on-one with the student groups and you're working with the LAs. So you've basically created this idea of teams in your classroom that you're responsible for helping each other learn. So if we think about it in terms of the LAs, what type of experience do the LAs have, right? So what the students are doing, the LAs, they are really facilitating those learning teams. So they're working with students and they're helping students to understand how they're thinking about the material and engaging the students. They are not giving students answers, they are facilitating the learning. The other thing that LAs do is they participate in what's called a weekly prep meeting. So they are meeting with the lead instructor every week to talk about what's happening in the classroom, what are the activities that they're going to be leading, where are students struggling, how are they interacting. It's really an opportunity to not only check in, but provide the LAs the opportunity to be able to contribute to the learning process, to contribute to doing the work in the classroom, and provide feedback to the instructor, very specific feedback about how students are doing in the classroom. And then finally, I had mentioned that there's what's called the pedagogy course. And really what that does is it allows the LAs to take a course their very first semester where they are learning about how people learn, how to ask questions of students, how to get students to open up and be able to bring out their ideas to make those small group conversations more effective, how to build relationships, how to think about equity and inclusion and learning theory. This is what that pedagogy course is really what makes this model so different than other models of peer support in a classroom, because there's really a deep dive. Students are reading actual literature, research articles about how people learn, and about all of these different topics so that they can become more effective in the ways that they engage with those student groups. Faculty, I think I've mentioned before, I've done a lot of work with faculty around using LAs in the classroom. And what I found, and again, I know there's some research that's in process of being published around this, is that using the LA model changes faculty perspective on teaching. It changes the way they teach because they have to become more metacognitive. They're working with the LAs, explaining to them why they're designing the activities the way they are, why the ways in which things connect, how they want students to develop their understanding of the content. And so with that, they recognize that it also takes more time, especially on the front end, because now it's less about what am I going to say in the examples I'm going to give to how do I plan this? How do I provide opportunities where students can engage in the material regardless of where they're starting from, right? Regardless of where they enter into the classroom, which allows for that equity piece. If you think back to those slides earlier with the ladders and the types of resources that students have, they need time to meet with the LAs and also develop and find activities. But that extra time and that extra work, students are being more successful in their courses. And I'll give you an example. I have a biology faculty who his very first semester, he had 0 students fail his intro to biology course or his general biology course because of having all of these various supports and resources for students to become more successful. Finally, faculty find they can't go back to lecturing. They see what a difference it makes. I've seen really great changes in faculty who are often kind of in those last 5 years, right? They're getting ready. You know, they've committed their careers to teaching. They're getting closer to retirement. They're looking for something, to kind of that last big kind of outside the box push goal, I sometimes, or stretch goal. And I find that those are some of the faculty that are the most excited about using LAs in the classroom because they're able to take all of that experience and embed it in a different way in their classroom. And then what happens is you start in one classroom and then suddenly you're teaching another course and you're thinking about ways in which you can engage students in activities instead of just lecturing to them. And so it really changes how faculty think about their classroom and their teaching approach. So what are those learning assistant model goals? Again, it allows us to have curriculum and course transformation, which is really what we will be focusing on during that workshop on Tuesday. Institutional change, and what we need for that institutional change to occur. And I'll be talking with the administrators about creating and sustaining and growing an LA program. For those of you who are doing research, it gives you lots of opportunities to be able to do some research on what's happening with your students, with your LAs, and with your faculty. And it also provides an opportunity if you are looking to recruit and prepare STEM teachers, it gives them some opportunities to begin to have those learning experiences with their peers, and also start thinking about how people learn and how that's applied to their content area through the pedagogy class. So we often say it's really a stealth faculty development program because you have that opportunity to engage on all of these different levels, and it ends up changing the work that you do and the way that you approach teaching. So these pieces I'm actually going to fast forward through because we're getting towards the end. And this is really when you're thinking about more advanced structures for the LA model. The last few things I'll share with you is there is a Learning Assistant Alliance. It's an international group of folks who are using LAs and who come together to support each other. So we have both personnel resources. They've developed some electronic resources for as you grow your program. There are some research instruments that you can use for assessment, and then also other tools that you can use as you create that pedagogy course. Again, that final thing was just a map. And so the last part of my presentation is just to allow you to ask whatever questions that you might have for me. If you're watching this asynchronously, feel free to collect questions, and we can get you my email address, and I'd be more than happy to respond to those questions. Otherwise, I am doing a coffee hour on Tuesday, I believe from 3:30 to 4:30. And I would be more than happy to have a conversation with you about the LA model then. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Becky. Wow, you look very relaxed, like you didn't do anything at all while we were. That was fantastic. Thank you for the really wonderful presentation and lots of good conversation in the chat. I really enjoyed everybody's contributions and thoughts about this. Yeah, so let's go to questions, and we have one already in the chat. So let's start with that one. I'll go ahead and read it. So this is from Jim Olson. Again, he's our math education professor, one of our math education professors. So he says, a faculty member will be switching from mainly stand and delivered to using some group cooperative learning. For a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 50 minutes each day class, what is an estimate of the amount of time that is typically spent doing group cooperative activities?
Yep, and I think that's a really great question. And there's not an easy answer because I think it really depends on the faculty member. It depends on where they are in the process of transitioning from that stand and deliver or lecturing component over to that collaborative learning, and what their course goals are. So for many people who start out, they might be aiming to do one activity per class, and maybe that's a 10 to 15 minute activity. Or even if that's too much, maybe they're starting out with one a week. And then as they're using that and they're doing that, they're starting to think about, oh, this would have been so much easier to do, or it would have been a better learning opportunity if I could create an activity. So I've seen folks start there. I've seen folks who are at a point now that they don't lecture at all. It's all active learning activities, or their lecture might be 4 to 5 minutes per class session. I've seen models where I worked with some faculty in statistics where they would do 2 days of lecture, and then their third day was an all-day, or not all day, but a whole class project that students would work on. And so students would know that they would get the activity ahead of time, and they'd be ready to go to spend that entire day doing that deep dive, or that entire class doing that deep dive into that activity. I hope that helps.
By the way, at this point, I think it might be useful just for everybody to turn on your microphone.
Yep, you can just ask instead of typing it in if you'd like.
Unless you have a barking dog or something else, but yeah, or you can type it in, and that's true. And I can read it as well if you want to. And also turn on your cameras so we can see you. Unless you're in your pajamas, then we don't want to see you. Sue is not in her pajamas. That's good. And Ernesta's got her baby with her.
And I've locked my children out, so if you hear them pounding on the door because they haven't had dinner.
Yeah, so anybody have some questions?
I think you've brought up some great ideas. Financially, it might be a little bit difficult to sort of implement having, LAs in all of these classrooms, but the active learning is certainly things that our department is working with. And as an individual faculty, I find that I'm thinking more and more about these kinds of activities, because the traditional way of lecture teaching and learning is not as effective as we would like it to be, for sure. But I would also maybe propose that, using the quizzes at the end of the chapters, sometimes they have some really wonderful questions that we could have students work on ahead of time, and then maybe work with together in class, something like that. Might be a great way to engage them.
Well, and I think as you think about expanding the LA model, really looking for classes where you can see the biggest impact. So looking at your data and looking at where's your highest failure rate, where's your largest DFW rate, where could you incorporate the approach, and also where's the biggest opportunity gap, and maybe start there. Or what are your gateway courses that students don't tend to be able to make it into the major because they can't get past that course. And so really strategically thinking about where to start. And then what you'll find is that students will start wondering why all of their classes don't have LAs, right? They'll have this great experience and say, hey, I learned so much more. Why is it so-and-so using LAs? Or why isn't this happening later on in my math courses or my physics courses? And so you end up with a little bit of pressure from the students, right? To be able to move administration forward around thinking about how to allocate the resources to be able to increase the number of LAs or the number of courses that are using LAs.
By the way, Sue, I just wanted to make a comment about your statement. So don't engage in deficit thinking, right? What we don't have.
That's true, I understand. But something occurred to me as you've been talking and we've been thinking about this, is we could also, as we break the students into groups, right, have sort of an appointed kind of LA for that group that would speak out for the students, and these could rotate at various times, and so to make sure that their concerns are expressed and heard during the course as well, might be also a good bridge to the next step.
I guess I had another question. So let's say we had a class of 28 students, and they were in groups of size 4 maybe, and I'm making that up, 7 groups. How many LAs would we need for a class like that, 28 or 30 students?
Again, I think that's going to be up to you and the conversation that you're having with whoever's funding those. At SCSU and at ARCC, I've been using the number of 24 with students in groups of 4 so that each LA has 6 groups to work with. And so that has been a very manageable, I did that right? 6 times 4, 24. Okay, sometimes, I'm a chemist. So that seems, we found that to be a really reasonable number, because then what we do is the LA stays with those 6 groups for the entire semester. And even in my smaller classes, I have several math courses at ARCC that only have 24 students in them, or 25. And so even just having that one LA and the instructor, then the 2 of them they work together with the students. When I taught chemistry, my class was 150 students. So I would have 6 LAs and me. And so what that allowed me to do with the larger classes is I could go and work with the students who needed me most, right? The LAs could move around, they'd work within their groups, and then I would just come over and work, like I said, with the students who needed me most, or go through and help the LAs if they were getting stuck with something. And that was a really efficient and effective way to get to meet students' needs in those small groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. And your diagram didn't indicate that. Your diagram made it look like an LA was maybe going to take care of 2 or 3 groups. So this sounds a little more reasonable, that LA is going to be handling 6 groups, especially since we're going to be on a limited budget.
Right. And again, that's the model that we've been using. The one thing we've been able to use at ARCC that we were not doing at SCSU was we were able to hire students who had work study. So what that meant is we didn't have to have an extra, and the majority of our students are on work study. And so we didn't, at this point, don't need to have a huge budget. But at the end of the day, it's about $1,500, depending on what your rate of pay is for an LA. I don't know what it is for you all. I think for us, it's $10 or $11. That's pretty inexpensive if you think about it, especially if you're retaining students. Students aren't failing, they're being able to move forward. One of the things I'm going to talk about during the scaling and sustaining workshop tomorrow is about different ways that you could fund this type of work, whether it's having a separate budget, whether it's having students pay fees, whether it's capturing a little bit of the tuition. But again, at the end of the day, if you have students moving forward, then you can transition money away from activities or supports that you don't need anymore, because you've got them moving forward more quickly and more effectively.
I'm glad that you mentioned retention, because this was something I wanted to ask you about. And it's a big issue, of course, if the institution or the department feels they're on a constrained budget. Are you aware of any institutions that said, we don't have any money, we're concerned about our retention numbers, where are we losing our students? We're losing them, let's say, in first-year mathematics. We'll try LAs out there, and that they find that they're retaining students, and that this is actually, that it's actually been demonstrated somewhere that this is a profitable approach, as well as being a good learning approach.
Jim, I saw you're ready.
Absolutely, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's typically how most institutions begin, is they start small, they take data, they look for that growth, and then they grow and invest from there. So that's a very typical approach. I think there are, last I looked, I want to say 150 institutions across the world that are using, higher ed institutions that are using LAs. So there's a lot of research out there around the effectiveness, around the implementation. And I think I know you mentioned that WIU is part of the LA Alliance. There's a lot of information there if you get the opportunity to go look around, that will support that idea. There are institutions that don't pay their LAs. There are institutions where they give them credit for taking the LA class, or they give them, what's the word? Internship credit, basically, for doing this type of work. I personally find having students get paid makes them, the LAs, they take it more seriously because it's their job. Even though, at the end, they're often getting paid more than they would have made, if they were working at Subway or any of the other, types of jobs that our college students typically have.
So I was just curious to follow
Oh,
up.
go ahead, Jeff.
When you were talking about your class of 150 and breaking up into groups,
Mhm.
what kind of a classroom are you using that lets you go around to those different groups and let them turn toward each other and interact?
So I had a huge lecture hall that had seats and tables that didn't move. So we have like those little desk things that come up off the side of the chair. And so what I would do is I would ask to be scheduled in a 250 person room and for my 150, and then I would cluster them. So I basically would section off the lecture hall, and then we would cluster the students in their little groups of 4. So they'd have 2 here, then 2 in the other row, so they could turn around and look at each other. And we'd move them around so that the LAs could get there and walk through. But because they only needed to be within 2 or 3 rows, you didn't need necessarily as much mobility. Now it's COVID, so it's more complicated. And so, but at the same time, you'll have fewer people in a room anyway because of COVID. So you would have more opportunities to move around. But I've done it in lecture halls. I've done it in rooms where I can actually move tables around. As this grows, it also gives you an opportunity to start having conversations about how useful your classrooms are, right? So at ARCC, we've been getting some new furniture in our rooms that allow for active learning. So, I think it leads, seeing that success, I think can lead to opportunities for rethinking what types of spaces we need to be effective teachers.
Let me just make a few I should let everybody talk instead of myself because I talk too much, but I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things, and so many of you brought up great points and good questions. The retention aspect of this is so important. I'm going to preach here. I'm going to preach. So WIU has been caught in this deficit budgetary crisis thinking for too long. And we need to start thinking positively about how we're going to build up enrollment and how we're going to improve the learning that we provide our students that makes us an attractive place that people want to come to. And LAs are one, it's not the only solution, but it's one important solution for making that kind of transformation where we can really do positive work to build up our enrollment and build up the experience that we provide our students. And meeting that equity gap is important because those are the kinds of students that we are designed and created to serve. Particularly in our program, in terms of retention, the last 2 years, freshmen fall to spring retention in the engineering program, which is what Susie and I are primarily serving up at the Quad City campus, has gone from about 60% to 90%, over 90% retention in the program. So it just makes a huge difference. We deliberately chose to go with 2 LAs, even though our per class, even though our classes are smaller. And one of the reasons we did was Kristy Mindrup and I went to a conference in Colorado 6-7 years ago already, geez, where the LAs said that they really appreciated having a partner. Yeah. And so we decided, well, shoot, if we're going to do it, let's do it right, so that we have the students working as partners. And that has proved to be, I think, something very valuable that the LAs themselves really appreciate, is having somebody with them. They complement each other in terms of their strengths. We had one in particular very interesting pairing of this female math student, Gabby, who lived up to her name, and then a male student, Steve, who was extremely quiet and shy, but very bright. And they worked so well together and they could help each other. They relied on each other. And so that was very meaningful, but it depends on your class and the environment. But I think in terms of how much it cost us for 4 LAs for a year, and this included the pedagogy course, we'd give them a stipend to take a 1 credit hour course. And then 4 LAs for the year, it cost about $10,000. So if you think about retaining 4 new students, I mean, even 1 new student would cover that. So there's really a lot of possibility that we need to consider about what kinds of things can we grow into. So sorry.
And I'm going to jump in, and I don't know if your institution talks about this, but one of the things we found both at SCSU and at ARCC is that we get a better return on investment on the dollars that we spend on retaining students we already have than on recruiting new students to the institution. And we tend to spend most of our money trying to get them to us as opposed to getting them to stay. And so this would be one of those opportunities to think about investing in your retention.
I just wanted to add that, we're kind of doing that a little bit here already with the teaching assistants. I guess they're not called LAs, but they're teaching assistants. And it's going to vary a little bit on different faculty on how they sort of use them in class, but also the first year experience program has those peer mentors that are assigned. And honestly, I've sort of struggled a little bit with sort of how to use them efficiently, but this conversation in your seminar has certainly given me some thought or things to think about on how to work with them, next time, and also kind of restructuring my class a little bit. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your insight.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about the peer mentors for the first year experience courses is that the program designers deliberately don't want content. They don't want to match content. They want it to be about the experience of being a student, not about the content. Whereas the LAs, it is about the experience of being a student, but it's really focused on, it's just slightly a more advanced level of understanding of the content and being able to be good guides for the students. That makes a difference.
Yeah, they've changed that a little bit. I think initially they started out with a content-based, or at least they paired up the majors with the faculty in that same area. And then the last few years, I think they've changed that. So it might be something worth kind of revisiting at some point.
Well, there will be additional opportunities. Please consider attending. Maybe I should turn this over to Kishra because Kishra can talk about the workshops for tomorrow, but please consider attending the workshops, encouraging people who were eating dinner tonight for some reason they wanted to eat dinner instead of come to a lecture. But encourage them to come tomorrow. We have a lecture that the workshop from 10 to 11:30 is focused on implementing the LAs in your classroom. And then the workshop from 1 to 2 is focused on the administrative aspects. Mm-hmm. So if you have a chair, Everett asked, where's his chair? So if you have a chair who might be benefit from attending this, then they should encourage them to come. And then from 2 to 2:45, the LAs, some of our former LAs will be on a panel, and you can talk to them about their experiences. And then at 3:30 to 4:30 is Becky's coffee hour. She can't give us any coffee, but we can look at each other drinking coffee and talk. But yeah, let me turn it over to Dr. Capelli.
All right. Well, Jim, you kind of summarized the workshops that are happening tomorrow. If you received the flyer PDF from me, the link at the bottom of the flyer, which is where my mouse is right now, it's clickable, and that's how you can join the workshops. Looks like there is some hiccup with the registration system, so we're just going to forego that process. You can directly click on the Zoom link and connect with the workshop that you find appealing to you and interesting to you. So look forward to working with all of you. And thank you, Becky, once again, for giving this wonderful lecture, telling us about the LA program, and also doing these workshops tomorrow. Thanks in advance for going into the details and helping us really think about how we could implement this in all of our classes. So I personal thank you from my side.
Thank you. And I did throw my email in there because I know sometimes you may have other things going on and are not able to attend. I'm happy to answer questions at any time. I know Jim and I talk, about the LA program and have touched base. And, you know, if there are things you're thinking about in your classroom, I have lots of resources. I'm considered an LA agent, so I work with folks from all across the world around helping people set up LA programs and really thinking about how to convert their classrooms from lecture to active learning. So I'm very passionate about that. And you could probably tell I'm very passionate about equity. So any chance, if you'd like to chat, I'd be more than happy. So like I said, my email address is in the chat box, and hopefully I'll see many of you at one point tomorrow.
All right, wonderful.
you.
So just so that all of you have the link to the workshops, I'm putting that in the chat. So make sure you copy it and save it somewhere on your desktop.
And do try. So Susie mentioned that she also got bumped. I don't know what the problem is, but anyway, so do email CITR so they know if you're interested in attending the workshop, because then they'll be distributing materials and other things like that if you're planning on attending. So, but certainly just go, if you can't get a response or whatever, just go to the link. That's fine. But
I will welcome you all.
okay.
Right. Have a great night.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye. See you tomorrow.
Jim and Kishore, do we need to do any